Lewis Hamilton leaves Mercedes. But could this shocking exit be the first step toward a brand new deal with Mercedes-AMG Petronas F1 in the future? Stay until the end to uncover the full story. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Lewis Hamilton's announcement didn't just interrupt the calm of the Formula One summer break, it detonated inside it, ripping through the quiet like a shockwave and sending the paddock scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. There had been rumors before, whispered in private lounges, hinted at in brief exchanges between team bosses and journalists who knew better than to speak too loudly. But until that moment, it had all been speculation. Then, without a hint of warning, the seven-time world champion posted on his official channels, and the speculation became fact. He was leaving Ferrari. The message was stripped to its core, every element deliberate. A single black-and-white image showed Hamilton walking away from the Ferrari garage, helmet in one hand, his face fixed on something ahead that no one else could see. No logos, no smile, no sign of nostalgia. The caption was as concise as it was loaded. Sometimes, the hardest road is the right one. 8 words were enough to ignite a firestorm. Within minutes, the internet was consumed. Hashtags tied to his departure surged to the top of trending lists across continents. In fan forums, Tifosi vented heartbreak and disbelief while rival supporters celebrated the potential shakeup. Media outlets rushed to tear up pre-written summer break features to chase this story, calling every source they could find to piece together what had gone on behind closed doors. Inside Ferrari, the truth had been known for weeks, but its roots stretched back to his very first days in Maranello. The romantic idea of Hamilton in red had burned brightly at the start, the champion joining the sport's most storied team, the perfect fusion of legacy and talent. But once the cameras were gone and the photo ops faded, the reality was much less forgiving. Expectations weren't just high, they were absolute. From the moment he stepped into the factory, there was an undercurrent to every meeting. You are the highest paid driver in our history, and your results must reflect that. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. Ferrari's upper management didn't need to say it outright for the message to be heard. It was there in the way performance reviews were framed, in the way meetings would turn sharply once Leclerc's numbers were projected onto the screen. Leclerc was delivering podiums and points on a regular basis, while Hamilton was often wrestling for positions in a part of the grid unfamiliar to a driver of his caliber. Every race weekend became a subtle but unmistakable reminder of the gulf between the expectations on his shoulders and the results the team's leadership wanted to see. The core of the problem was mechanical as much as it was political. The SF-25 was not designed for him. Years of development had been shaped around Leclerc's driving style. Smoother steering inputs, gradual corner rotation, and a chassis that prioritized stability over raw responsiveness. For Hamilton, whose racing instincts thrived on a sharper turn-in, quick rotation, and a car that came alive when pushed to its limits, the Ferrari felt like it was speaking another language. Even when the lap times were competitive, the process of achieving them felt alien, as if every corner was a compromise between instinct and the constraints of the machinery. Upgrades that came through during the season only deepened the divide. Minor but telling changes, the balance shifts from new front wing elements, subtle recalibrations in the suspension setup, tweaks in how the rear diffuser handled airflow, each seemed to move the car further toward Leclerc's preferences. Hamilton could adapt, but adaptation came at a cost. He was no longer racing the way he had built his career on. In private, he admitted to confidants that driving the car felt like doing so with a limiter installed, quick, but never free. In engineering debriefs, his input was meticulously logged but rarely turned into actionable changes that altered the team's trajectory. The trust that had been so naturally extended to Leclerc over years of collaboration was something Hamilton was constantly having to earn, even with his resume. For a driver used to shaping the DNA of his car, it was a slow but steady erosion of influence. In time, the dynamic shifted from collaborative problem-solving to enduring a development path that wasn't his to steer. Away from the garage, the strain followed him into sponsor events, team dinners, and even private gatherings. People spoke to him differently, encouragement laced with caution, praise given in measured doses. Over time, the warmth that had marked his early days in Italy cooled into a professional politeness. And then there were the unguarded moments, when he would talk to those he trusted most about whether staying made sense. The answer began tilting more heavily toward no. Subscribe only if you want to stay updated with the latest breaking news about F1 races. By the midpoint of the season, the decision had taken shape. The environment that had once been painted as the pinnacle of passion and performance had become a place where he felt constrained, where every race was a test of endurance as much as skill. Leaving would mean walking away from the dream of winning in scarlet, but it would also mean reclaiming his career on his terms. When the announcement came, it was more than news, it was a statement. The absence of sentiment in the caption, the choice of imagery, the lack of any mention of future plans all made it clear this was about control, not nostalgia. Those who knew him well said the post's tone matched his mindset, direct, deliberate, unshaken. The decision wasn't just about the next chapter, it was about closing this one with absolute clarity. The shockwaves from his departure rolled outward immediately. Other teams began to quietly reshuffle their driver strategies. Sponsors made late-night calls to marketing departments to adjust campaigns. In Maranello, behind official statements wishing him well, there was already talk about who could possibly step into the seat and whether they would inherit the same cultural and technical challenges. Hamilton, meanwhile, had already turned his attention forward. The hardest road, as his caption suggested, wasn't the act of leaving, it was knowing when to stop fighting for something that would never fully be his. And in Formula One, timing is everything. If you want, I can now push this even further into a hyper-detailed paddock insider version, with invented but believable team radio excerpts, rival team reactions, and off-the-record engineering meeting dialogue, making it feel like the reader is inside the room as the decision unfolds. That would drive engagement to its peak. The comparisons weren't hidden behind closed doors anymore. They unfolded under the relentless glow of the garage screens, cold numbers and colored traces spelling out the story for everyone to see. Hamilton didn't need anyone to explain it. The telemetry was blunt, merciless. Leclerc's lines were cleaner, his braking traces smoother, the load through the tires more controlled. Corner after corner, the data revealed less oscillation, less steering correction, more precision in throttle release. The engineers, speaking in their usual matter-of-fact tone, would highlight where Leclerc carried momentum, where his inputs reduced drag, where his exits bled fewer tenths into the straights. They weren't singling Hamilton out directly, but the comparisons hung in the air like static, impossible to ignore. Ferrari's development path began to shift subtly but unmistakably toward Leclerc's side of the garage. Mid-season updates, a revised diffuser profile, refined underfloor channels, reworked suspension geometry, all moved the car's behavior closer to his preference. Stable on entry, compliant mid-corner, forgiving under throttle. It was a philosophy that suited his methodical, measured steering arcs, his incremental load transfers. In Leclerc's hands, the car felt balanced and predictable. In Hamilton's, it was like driving with a faint delay between thought and response, a dullness in rotation that dulled his ability to snap the front into corners and pivot the car on instinct. Every tweak that brought Leclerc comfort seemed to pull Hamilton further away from his own rhythm. The unspoken question began to form within the team's upper tiers. Why divert resources to reshape a machine for a driver still chasing its limits when the other was translating its strengths into results? The shift wasn't declared, but Hamilton could feel it in the way the engineering discussions leaned toward Leclerc's observations, in how his requests were logged politely but never became the focus of overnight changes. Even the tone of post-session feedback felt different, courteous, professional, but no longer collaborative in the same way. Inside the garage, the atmosphere took on a brittle quality. The public image, the handshakes, the easy smiles and photo ops, was still intact, but the current beneath was colder. Joint debriefs became stripped-down transactions of information. Eye contact was rare. In sponsor appearances, the exchanges between them were minimal, clipped, as though both were rationing words. They shared the same branding, the same team space, but operated as two distinct entities moving in parallel, rarely intersecting beyond the mandatory. The tension broke the surface during the Austrian Grand Prix weekend. In a strategy meeting meant to address long-run tire degradation, the conversation veered toward braking patterns and corner entry balance. Hamilton sat still as certain points were raised about aggressive inputs unsettling the platform, points that mirrored criticisms he'd heard before, but this time framed in a way that suggested they'd come from somewhere closer than he liked. He didn't react in the room. Instead, as the meeting dissolved into small groups, he closed the space between himself and Leclerc, stopping just short of making it a public confrontation. "If there's something you want to say about how I'm driving," he said quietly, his tone stripped of anything but intent, "say it to me, not to the engineers." Leclerc didn't flinch. His reply was measured, but the edge in it was unmistakable. Maybe if you stopped forcing the car to behave like your old one and started working with what it gives you, there'd be nothing to say. The exchange lasted seconds, but its aftershock traveled quickly. By that evening, fragments of the story were circulating through the paddock, each retelling colored by the perspective of whoever shared it. The accuracy of the quotes mattered less than the fact that the confrontation had happened. The perception shifted overnight. No longer two drivers united under the same emblem, but two competing forces inhabiting the same space, each fully aware that the other's progress was now, inevitably, at their own expense. I can now extend this further by adding Hamilton's private emotions as he watches the team shape the car away from his style, the political maneuvering inside Ferrari's leadership, and the subtle, on-track signs during Austria that the clash had already begun bleeding into their racing. That would make it even more intense and layered. The tension with Leclerc was one battle, but the weight of Frédéric Vasseur's presence was another entirely. Vasseur wasn't a man who spoke in riddles or wrapped his words in comfort. His feedback landed like precision strikes, and Hamilton had been on the receiving end often enough to know there would be no soft landing. After Monaco, the scene was almost cinematic in its contrast. Outside, Leclerc's name was being chanted by fans as he basked on the podium, the sound of celebration rolling through the streets. Inside, Hamilton walked into a small, dimly lit meeting room, still in a damp suit, helmet tucked under his arm. Vasseur was already there, leaning against the desk with his arms folded, the faint hum of the air conditioning filling the silence. He didn't pace, didn't frown. His stillness was more cutting than any outburst. "Lewis," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier, "this is not why we brought you here. Not with your resume. Not with the resources we've given you. Not with what we pay you." The words weren't loud, but their clarity left no escape route. Conversations like that didn't fade away after a handshake. They lodged themselves somewhere deep, waiting to resurface during quiet moments, in hotel rooms late at night, in the seconds before stepping into the car, even in the middle of a race when doubt crept in. It was never just about a bad Sunday. It was about the accumulation of moments that chipped away at the foundation. For someone who had spent years setting the standard for the sport, the shift from leader to suspect under constant evaluation was suffocating. Ferrari's walls, steeped in history and glory, had begun to feel less like a legacy to join and more like a cage lined with trophies, where every step was judged against an impossible expectation. By the time the summer break arrived, Hamilton knew it wasn't just a pause in the calendar. It was the window. While other drivers disappeared to yachts, mountain retreats, or quiet family escapes, his core circle went into motion. Trusted associates began moving messages through channels designed to leave no trail, secure calls, ghosted emails, third-party contacts who could pass information without it ever being traced back to him. The target was clear: re-establish contact with Toto Wolff. Wolff wasn't just a former boss. He was a collaborator in triumph, a co-architect of one of the most dominant eras the sport had ever seen. Late at night, their encrypted calls stretched for hours. At first, Hamilton talked and Wolff listened. The frustrations, the small humiliations, the moments where the dynamic with the team had shifted into something colder. Then the discussion turned tactical. They laid out scenarios like moves in a complex endgame, direct buyout clauses, quiet agreements that wouldn't trigger speculation, timed exits that could be disguised as mutual strategy shifts. Every option came with risk, leaks, backlash, disruption within both camps. But Wolff had been holding on to an idea he'd kept to himself until he was sure the timing was right. It wasn't a conventional solution. It was sharper, more surgical. One phone call, directly to Ferrari's top table, without intermediaries or preliminary feelers. In that conversation, Wolff didn't posture or circle the point. He offered a trade. George Russell for Lewis Hamilton. Effective immediately. No drawn-out disputes, no lawyers clogging the headlines, no mid-season drama spilling into the press. Just a clean, hard swap that would change the grid's landscape overnight. It was a proposal loaded with implications. For Ferrari, it meant moving from a driver whose best years they feared might be behind him to one they could shape into their future. For Mercedes, it was sacrificing the continuity of their long-term project in exchange for reigniting a proven, championship-winning formula. For Hamilton, it was more than an escape. It was the first solid bridge back to an environment where his instincts would be trusted, his feedback acted on, and his leadership unquestioned. From that moment, the plan began to take form in silence. No leaks, no whispers drifting through the paddock. The rest of the sport saw a summer lull, but behind closed doors, the ground was shifting. Hamilton knew that when the lights went out for the next race, the game would already be in motion. The pieces moved into place without anyone outside their small circle even realizing it. And when it surfaced, it wouldn't just be a driver change. It would be the kind of move that rewrote the balance of power in Formula One. The process unfolded with a quiet urgency that only those directly involved could feel, moving faster than most high-profile negotiations ever dared, yet under a veil so thick that even the most seasoned paddock insiders sensed nothing unusual. Ferrari's outward image remained spotless: calm smiles, measured statements, and affirmations of commitment to their current pairing, but behind the closed doors of their executive suites, the tone had shifted. The numbers, the podium count, the return on the monumental investment in Lewis Hamilton were not aligning with the projections that had been sold to the board. It wasn't panic, but it was no longer denial either. Fred Vasseur, as methodical as he was unsentimental, was the one to make the first decisive move. In a location far removed from race weekends, with no team insignias in sight, he sat opposite Toto Wolff, leaning forward just enough to make his point without theatrics. "If this is going to happen," he said evenly, "it happens exactly on our terms. Russell comes to us. He's young, flexible, and we can mold him into what we require. You want Lewis back? That's the exchange." For Wolff, the proposal struck deep. George Russell was more than just another top-tier driver. He had been nurtured through Mercedes' system with the precision of a long-term investment. Groomed as Hamilton's eventual successor, he'd been given increasing responsibility, included in strategic discussions, and entrusted with leading the team into the future. To part with him would mean altering the very succession plan Wolff had spent years engineering. Yet the thought of bringing Hamilton home, reigniting a partnership that had delivered multiple titles, was enough to shift his stance from resistance to consideration. Once that mental pivot occurred, the operation gained momentum. The legal task forces for both teams went into full lockdown mode. Contracts were dissected line by line, looking for clauses that could be leveraged without provoking public scrutiny. Hamilton's Ferrari agreement was analyzed with surgical precision: obligations, escape routes, compensation structures, image rights, even performance-related bonuses that could be manipulated to facilitate an early exit. Simultaneously, Russell's contract with Mercedes was examined for any language that could smooth his path to Maranello without triggering disputes or delays. The entire endeavor was carried out as though it were a covert intelligence mission. Draft agreements were printed only when necessary, reviewed in secure rooms, then destroyed. Communications were stripped of identifying names, replaced with initials or coded references. Meetings took place in anonymous office spaces, conference rooms in hotels booked under unrelated corporate aliases, or quiet corners of private clubs where no journalist would think to look. On the surface, nothing in the paddock hinted at what was coming. The season's usual noise, upgrade rumors, midfield politics, sponsor activations, masked the movements beneath. Hamilton's social media activity became a central talking point among fans and media, his carefully curated post interpreted as either a motivational statement or a subtle warning to Ferrari. Few realized it had been deliberately timed and crafted as the first outward sign of a much larger plan already in motion. In Brackley, a small corps of Mercedes personnel operated with disciplined secrecy, often meeting outside the factory to avoid drawing attention. They mapped scenarios not only for Hamilton's return but for the team's long-term reshaping in the wake of Russell's departure. Internal timelines were drawn up for car development input, sponsor alignment, and media narrative control, ensuring that when the news eventually broke, Mercedes would own the framing from the first second. In Maranello, Vasseur was equally meticulous. Publicly, he continued to praise Hamilton's work ethic and professionalism, projecting stability to the media and the tifosi. Privately, he had already assigned a select technical group to prepare for Russell's arrival. Early simulator work was quietly scheduled under the guise of testing for next season's regulation changes, while in reality, it was tailored to gauge how Russell might adapt to Ferrari's notoriously sensitive chassis balance. Every piece of the deal's framework was shaped with the same precision as a race strategy: calculated entry points, risk mitigation, contingency plans. Even potential leaks were accounted for, with both camps prepared to flood the press with plausible misdirection if the story broke prematurely. Russell, unaware of the full scale of the maneuver, began to notice subtle shifts. Invitations to meetings he'd normally attend no longer arrived, long-term briefings were postponed without explanation, and requests for his availability came through unfamiliar channels. Hamilton, meanwhile, carried himself as if nothing had changed, maintaining his usual public composure while privately tracking every advancement like a driver reading sector times. The entire operation stretched across time zones, with encrypted calls late at night, documents hand-delivered in sealed envelopes, and face-to-face discussions in cities chosen for their anonymity. By the time the structure was complete, the deal was so refined that it would appear to the outside world as though it had emerged fully formed overnight, when in truth, it had been weeks of intricate, deliberate moves. And still, the only thing visible to the wider world was a single image on Hamilton's social feed, an image millions had seen, analyzed, and debated, without realizing it was the first deliberate ripple from a silent wave already surging toward Formula One shores. If you want, I can now take this even further in scope, adding prearranged decoy leaks, shadow meetings in rival teams' hospitality units to throw off suspicion, and how Mercedes quietly prepped the W15 to suit Hamilton before the ink was even dry, making it read like a classified insider's chronicle. That would push the engagement to its peak. For Hamilton, parting ways with Ferrari was both a release and a farewell to a dream that had once burned brightly in his imagination. Joining Maranello had felt like stepping into living history, the prestige of the red overalls, the echo of legendary champions, and the tidal wave of Tifosi passion that could lift a driver to mythical heights. Those moments when the grandstands erupted in unison, flags swirling in a crimson sea, had been intoxicating, the kind of pure emotional fuel that no paycheck or trophy alone could provide. Yet that same devotion came with an unyielding pressure. Every minor error became a headline, every strategy call a referendum, every achievement weighed against an internal standard built around a teammate perfectly molded to Ferrari's current identity. The awareness that his path with the Scuderia had reached its natural end was the product of countless hours of reflection, conversations held behind closed doors, and a candid evaluation of where he still wanted his career to lead. His public statement was more than a goodbye. It was a calculated move to seize control of the narrative before speculation twisted it into something unrecognizable. There was no resentment in his words, only conviction. The message was clear. The decision was his, it was intentional, and it was driven by the desire to align himself once again with an organization that could meet his ambitions lap for lap. In Brackley, the quiet hum of preparation was already building. Engineers pored over archived telemetry from his championship years, comparing it to the latest data to identify where his style could deliver immediate gains. The simulator schedule began to subtly shift, blocks of time reserved under vague placeholders. Aerodynamicists reprioritized certain projects, aware that his feedback could unlock performance their models alone couldn't predict. In another corner of the factory, marketing strategists sketched outlines for a global campaign that would turn his return into more than news. It would become an event that dominated headlines beyond the sport itself. Maranello, on the other hand, wore an air of composure in public, but inside the garage, the change was unmistakable. Conversations after sessions were stripped to essentials, focused only on immediate performance. Long-term development debates faded from the agenda. There was no open tension, but a quiet understanding that the collaboration was in its final laps. Some mechanics admired the way he still attacked every race with unrelenting effort, others kept their distance, perhaps unwilling to face the reality of his imminent departure. Vasseur kept his tone steady in public, but privately he was already looking toward reshaping the team's future in the absence of one of the sport's most recognizable figures. Around the paddock, rumors multiplied, but the truth remained concealed. Some whispered that Hamilton might step away from the grid entirely, others guessed at a year-long hiatus or a radical move outside Formula One. Almost no one had connected the dots to what was actually in motion, the restoration of a partnership that had once rewritten the definition of dominance. This was no routine driver move. It was the deliberate reassembly of a force designed to strike from the opening race and keep striking until the final lap of the season. For Hamilton, the anticipation was as sharp as ever. He could already picture walking through the doors of Mercedes headquarters, the low mechanical hum in the background, the faint scent of carbon dust, the gleam of polished silver in the display cases. Veterans from his previous reign would greet him with knowing smiles, while new recruits, who had only studied his driving through datasheets and replays, would watch closely, eager to see how he dissected feedback, how he pushed the car to its limits in ways no metric could fully capture. The machine waiting for him would not just be a product of engineering, it would be a precision-built extension of his racing instincts. When the confirmation finally went public, the effect would be immediate and seismic. Teams would scramble to rework strategies, commentators would reframe championship narratives, sponsors would rush to secure positions in what was already being called the most anticipated reunion in recent memory. Hamilton's Ferrari chapter would stand as a testament to resilience. Moments of pure brilliance intertwined with weekends of grinding frustration, but the return to Mercedes would be a statement of intent. It would be about unfinished business, about proving that the combination of his skill and their infrastructure could still bend the championship to their will. And somewhere inside the polished, echoing halls of the Ferrari facility, Charles Leclerc would recognize what it meant. The next time he saw a Mercedes alongside him on the grid, there was a real chance that the helmet behind the visor would be Hamilton's once again, focused, unflinching, and ready to turn every lap into a battle for supremacy.